Hi folks, I'm Greg McLawsen, the Affidavit of Support lawyer. I help green card holders bring federal lawsuits to enforce their rights under the USCIS Form I-864. But before I did that, way back when I was a baby lawyer, I did something called a judicial clerkship. And this basically means you're like an assistant to judges. This is after you've been to law school and you've passed the bar exam. And it's sort of like additional training, but it's also kind of a first job. And you get to work with the judge on cases. And in the court that I worked in, one of the things I did was work every week on the Friday civil motions docket. And this is basically, civil cases are non-criminal cases. So anytime you have one party suing somebody else for money, that's a civil case. And in our court, one thing that we saw on our docket every single week was a whole bunch of cases by credit card companies suing consumers who didn't pay their credit card bills. You probably have a credit card, and if you're like me, you've probably never read the 30-page contract that came with that card when you signed up for it. But if you're also like me and you're like everybody else, you understand what happens if you don't pay that credit card bill. So the bill comes, you don't pay. The bill comes, you don't pay. A notice comes, another notice comes. It starts showing up in bright red letters. Everyone understands that eventually, if you don't pay that credit card bill, that company is going to sue you and get a judgment against you for the money that you didn't pay them. Well, in a lawsuit like that, any guesses how it turns out? Do you think the credit card company wins half the time, or a quarter of the time? No, they win every single time, because when it comes to that credit card agreement, it's pretty clear cut. You signed up for the credit card, and it's really clear that if you use it and you rack up a debt, you are responsible for that. And so once the credit card company sues you, you are really, really limited in terms of what you can do. Almost certainly, in every single case, what's going to be the best option is contacting that company and trying to work out a way for you to pay the debt before you get sued. What you can't do is walk into court when the credit card company sues you and say, "Whoa, I don't have any money." Well, that's something you should have thought about before you use the credit card, right? Because running up a debt gives that company the legal right to sue you to recover the debt. And the fact that you don't have enough money to pay them, or just as often, you have the money, but you don't want to pay it to a credit card company, that's not a legal defense. We can talk in a minute about bankruptcy, because that's a very different situation. But when it comes to your responsibility to the credit card company, it is not dependent on whether you have or want to pay down that debt. The Affidavit of Support is similar in the following way. When it comes to the law behind the Affidavit of Support, the core obligation is very clear. The sponsor who signs the Affidavit of Support has a financial responsibility to maintain the income of the immigrant at 125% of the poverty line. That's basically $1,500 per month. If that immigrant is unemployed, they have a right to get that $1,500 a month from the sponsor. That's simply clear cut. There are limited, specific legal issues, but the core of that is well established. In the same way that if you take money from a credit card company, you're going to have to pay it back. Those two things are just core, we call them black letter legal obligations, meaning you're not going to argue with that core legal proposition. Well, if you're a sponsor and you don't honor that binding obligation to the immigrant, they're unemployed, and you don't support them, it's very much like a credit card situation. So I, as the plaintiff's attorney, as the attorney representing the sponsored immigrant, contact a sponsor. And I say, hey, maybe you didn't read it, I don't know, but do you remember that piece of paperwork that you signed when this person became a resident? It's called the Affidavit of Support. Here's the nature of that obligation. You owe this person $1,500 a month, and basically, here's the bill. Well, that sponsor can do the smart thing and figure out a way to pay down that obligation. Or like the person who doesn't want to pay the credit card bill, they can throw my letter in the trash, throw the next one in the trash, and then the next thing they're going to get is a federal summons telling them that they've been sued for that obligation under the contract. Very much like credit card cases, we know how that's going to end. With extremely limited situations, it is kind of a foretold conclusion that what is going to happen is the plaintiff, the sponsored immigrant, is going to be able to get a judgment against the sponsor. So they can fight it if they want. All that's going to do is increase the legal fees that they're responsible for. Because as the person who signed the affidavit, if they make me and my client go to federal court to enforce the affidavit of support, the defendant, the sponsor who signed the affidavit, that person is responsible for paying my attorney's fees to pay my client's costs of litigation. So if they want to do what a defendant just did the other week in a case in California and make all of these excuses about why they're not responsible, just like the guy who's been sued by a credit card company who says, whoa, I don't have any money, I don't want to pay. Federal courts look at that and they say, well, that might even be true. But the fact that you either don't have enough money or don't want to pay this obligation, that's not a legal defense. And so that doesn't prevent the sponsored immigrant from taking the case to judgment against the sponsor. Now let's talk about bankruptcy. In the context of a consumer credit card, so credit card somebody takes out individually to pay for TVs and groceries, consumer goods, if that person eventually gets overwhelmed by their debt, they might have the opportunity to file for bankruptcy protection. This is where credit cards and the affidavit of support are importantly different. The only published decision to address this issue, published decisions are appellate decisions that get weighted by other courts. They're considered legal authority. That decision held that affidavit of support liability cannot be discharged in bankruptcy proceeding. Why? Because that court determined that it is similar to alimony, also called spousal maintenance in some cases, in some states. The bankruptcy code has a specific exception that says alimony obligations can't be discharged in bankruptcy. And the federal bankruptcy court that looked at this issue said, yeah, you know what? This obligation that one spouse has to another under the affidavit of support is essentially like an alimony obligation, and for the purpose of the bankruptcy code is also dischargeable. So the one sense in which it sort of makes sense in some situations for somebody to fight a credit card debt, they could allow the judgment to be taken against them and then turn around and file for bankruptcy protection. That doesn't make sense in the affidavit of support obligation, because under this court decision, the bankruptcy court's going to say, you can't do this. You can't seek bankruptcy protection from the affidavit of support liability. What this means is the defendant sponsor, they're just shooting themselves in the foot if they spend all of this money fighting the case in federal court and they force me as the plaintiff's attorney to spend all of this time and resources getting to a judgment. All of that is just going to be added on to what the sponsor has to pay at the end of the day, and they can't get away from it from bankruptcy protection. So in this sense, the affidavit of support is like a consumer credit card bill in terms of once you know that liability is coming your way, the very smartest thing you can do for yourself is figure out a structured, doable way to pay down the obligation and do that before it turns into costly litigation. Because unlike consumer credit card litigation, you don't have, at the end of the legal process, this potential escape valve of bankruptcy protection. In the affidavit of support context, if you litigate, make all of the plaintiff's attorneys do all of this work, it's just going to add on to the bill that you can't get away from. So in both contexts, but especially in the affidavit of support context, what you want to do if you're being smart is get your arms around the liability earlier in the process and find a way to come up with a doable payment plan to head this off before it comes contentious litigation, because that only makes things worse, and there's not a light at the end of the tunnel for you as the sponsor. Hope that's illuminating. If folks have comments, questions, feel free to jump into the comments on our YouTube channel or Facebook. Happy to answer them there. If you think you have a potential claim under the affidavit of support, reach out to me in a confidential manner on our website, soundimmigration.com. I do confidential case assessments for folks all across the United States. Hope that's helpful, and take care, everyone.